From October 6 to October 15, 1952, the Battle of White Horse Mountain took place. Communist Chinese forces mobilized the 38th Army to launch an offensive, aiming to simultaneously capture White Horse Mountain, also known as Hill 395, and Arrowhead Hill, or Hill 281. The defending forces, consisting of the 9th Infantry Division of the Republic of Korea Army and a French battalion, mounted a tenacious resistance. They successfully repelled the attacks of the CCF. During the battle, the exceptional performance of the 9th ROK Division earned it the nickname of White Horse Division. Now, let us revisit the events of this significant battle. The 9th ROK Division holds a unique place in Korean history. Before the democratization of the Republic of Korea, 3 of the nation's presidents, Park Chung-hee, Chun Doo-hwan, and Roh Tae-woo, had all served in the 9th Division. The division's subordinate units frequently found themselves entangled in political conflicts, such as the December 12 coup of 1979. The 9th ROK Division was established on October 25, 1950, and soon after, it was engaged in the war to defend the nation. On October 20, 1951, the 9th ROK Division took over defensive positions from the 3rd U.S. Division near the area of Chorwon. These positions included the strategically important Hill 395, known as White Horse Mountain, and Hill 281, known as Arrowhead Hill. In November, units of the 42nd CCF Army launched several small-scale attacks against the 9th ROK Division's positions on White Horse Mountain and Arrowhead Hill. However, these assaults were successfully repelled by the 9th ROK Division's defenders. Following these engagements, the 9th ROK Division remained stationed on the front lines until October 1952. The French battalion within the United Nations forces landed at Busan on November 29, 1950. From that point onward, they were assigned to the 23rd Regiment of the 2nd U.S. Division. At the beginning of 1951, the battalion endured several brutal battles, including the Battle of Twin Tunnels, the Battle of Chipiangani, and the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge. Throughout these engagements, the French battalion demonstrated remarkable resilience and combat effectiveness, earning high praise from senior U.S. commanders. On July 9, 1952, the French battalion, along with the 23rd Regiment, was dispatched to the Chorwon area. On October 3, the French battalion took over the positions of the 3rd Battalion, 23rd Regiment, including Arrowhead Hill. By the end of September 1952, the French battalion consisted of 1,016 officers and enlisted. The 38th CCF Army has long been a prominent elite force in China. Like its adversaries, the 38th CCF Army later became involved in highly controversial political events. After entering Korea on October 22, 1950, the 38th CCF Army participated in numerous major battles. Following over a year of training, reorganization, and replenishment, the 38th CCF Army set out from the Sukchon on May 5, 1952, heading toward the front lines. By May 15, they had arrived in the northwestern region of Chorwon, where they took over the defensive positions previously held by the 42nd CCF Army. In the central region of the Korean battlefield, there lies a strategic area known as the Iron Triangle, with Chorwon, Pyongyang, and Kimhwa forming its vertices. Prior to June 1951, the CCF relied on this region as a crucial base for troop movements and supply logistics. White Horse Mountain, Hill 395 and Arrowhead Hill, Hill 281 are located to the west of Chorwon, prominently jutting out on the northern bank of the Yakuk River within the United Nations Forces defensive line. These positions became 2 key strongholds and served as defensive barriers for the plains surrounding Chorwon. White Horse Mountain, in particular, was the dominant height in the surrounding area. The U.S. Army believed that if White Horse Mountain were to fall, the positions on either side would become difficult to defend, likely forcing a significant retreat along the entire front line. The Koreans believed that the shape of Hill 395 resembled a white horse lying down, leading them to name it White Horse Mountain or White Horse Hill. The main peak stands at an elevation of 395 meters. The CCF force referred to it as Hill 394.8. The entire hill extends approximately 3,000 meters from north to south and is 1,200 to 2,000 meters wide from east to west. The ROK River flows from the northeast to the southwest, passing along the southern side of White Horse Mountain before turning northwest. This river effectively separates White Horse Mountain from the rest of the United Nations forces' main line of resistance. The main supply line for the defending forces passed through the bridge, named Royal, located to the south of the hill. From the axis of the main ridge, the profile dropped sharply on the northeast to a small stream valley. Opposite this position was the enemy-held Hill 396. On the west and southwest, three prominent valleys deeply pierce the main ridge. Arrowhead Hill is located approximately 2,000 meters west of White Horse Mountain. CCF typically referred to Arrowhead Mountain as Hill 281.2. To the north of Arrowhead Hill, a ridge extends into the area controlled by the CCF. The ROK River flows from the east, winding around three sides of Arrowhead Mountain. A pontoon bridge is located at the base of the hillside in the rear. East of Arrowhead Hill, across the ROK River, lies a flat river valley with rice paddies, and Hill 278. Since both White Horse Mountain and Arrowhead Hill served as key strongholds north of the ROK River and were relatively isolated from other friendly positions, the CCF devised a plan to sever their connection to the rear. In early October 1952, the boundary between the 1st Corps and the 9th Corps was marked by the ROK River, located to the west of White Horse Mountain. To the east of this boundary was the U.S. 9th Corps, with the 9th ROK Division. To the west was the U.S. 1st Corps, including the 2nd U.S. Division's 23rd Regiment. The 9th ROK Division consisted of the 28th, 29th, and 30th Regiments, along with the newly formed 51st Regiment. On the front line, the 30th Regiment was positioned on the left, and the 29th Regiment on the right. Within the 30th Regiment, the 1st Battalion was responsible for defending the left flank at White Horse Mountain, while the 2nd Battalion defended the right flank around Chungmasan. The 3rd Battalion of the 30th Regiment served as the regimental reserve and was positioned on Hill 255, located about 1,000 meters southeast of White Horse Mountain. The main line of resistance of the Korea Army ran through the central peak of White Horse Mountain, where it protruded northward. To the north and northwest of MLR, several peaks rise above 300 meters. The northernmost ridge, known as Camel Ridge, served as the location of forward outposts for the defending forces. Within the sector of the 29th Regiment, the 1st Battalion of the 51st Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the 29th Regiment were positioned on the front line, with the remaining units held in reserve near the front. The 28th Regiment served as the divisional reserve, positioned near Chorwan. The division's headquarters was located at Changpali, 5 kilometers south of Chorwan. The commanding officer of the 9th ROK Division was Major General Kim Jong-ho. The 213th U.S. Field Artillery Battalion of the Utah National Guard established 2 forward observation posts, each manned by a 3-person team, within the defensive sector of the 9th ROK Division. The first observation post, known as Love, was situated near the main peak of White Horse Mountain. The second post, called Roger, was located on Hill 284. From this vantage point, observers had a clear view of White Horse Mountain's main peak, as well as the front and part of the rear slopes of Hill 396. Hill 396 was the launching point for the CCF's offensive. Within the 23rd U.S. Regiment sector, the main defensive position on Arrowhead Hill was manned by Company N of the French Battalion. The primary position on the northern side of Hill 278, located between White Horse Mountain and Arrowhead Hill, was defended by Company O. Between these positions lay a river valley with rice paddies, where Company P was stationed. To the left of the French battalion were the positions of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 23rd U.S. Regiment. The 3rd Battalion served as the regimental reserve, positioned behind the front line. On Arrowhead Hill, there was a forward observation post operated by the 37th U.S. Field Artillery Battalion. The main positions of the 38th CCF Army were located 3 to 4 kilometers north of White Horse Mountain, running parallel to the United Nations Forces defensive line. Between these two main lines were several forward outposts held by both sides, with a distance of over 1 kilometer between them. The 38th CCF Army deployed the 113th and 114th Divisions on the front line, with the 112th Division held in reserve. The commanding officer of the 38th CCF Army was General Jiang Yonghui. In September 1952, seeking to gain a favorable position during the Korean armistice negotiations, the CCF decided to launch a series of tactical counteroffensives across the front. The largest and most intense of these battles was the 38th Army's assault on White Horse Mountain and Arrowhead Hill. In early August 1952, Kim Man-young, a platoon leader from Company 9 of the 3rd Battalion, 28th Regiment of the 9th ROK Division, defected to the CCF. He provided detailed intelligence on the United Nations forces' defensive positions at White Horse Mountain. Using this information, the CCF devised a meticulous battle plan with the aim of annihilating the defenders of White Horse Mountain and Arrowhead Hill. According to the defector, the morale of the United Nations forces is low, their combat effectiveness weak, and their fortifications are not particularly strong. The detailed plan called for the entirety of the 340th Regiment of the 114th CCF Division to launch the attack on White Horse Mountain. The 342nd Regiment was designated as the reserve force, while the 334th Regiment of the 112th CCF Division was attached to the 114th CCF Division as the second echelon, tasked with carrying out the third wave of the assault. Additionally, a significant number of artillery and armored units were assigned to the 114th CCF Division to support the attack on White Horse Mountain. On the Arrowhead Mountain front, the 339th Regiment of the 113th CCF Division would commit 5 companies, along with supporting artillery and armored units, to the assault. The full-scale assault was scheduled to begin at 17:30 on October 5. To deceive the United Nations forces, the CCF planned to launch diversionary attacks prior to the main assault. The 337th Regiment would conduct feint operations at Siakyundong Northern Hill, also known as Pork Chop Hill, Hill 190.8, and Bongmyeongdong. In addition, the plan called for releasing water from Lake Pangnae-ho into the Yakuk River. The 114th CCF Division assigned specialized personnel to control the sluice gates to gradually release the water. Meanwhile, the 113th CCF Division was tasked with constructing a dam, 5 to 8 meters wide and 2 to 3 meters high, within the Yakuk River south of Hyeryanggi. This would maintain a high water level for 2 to 3 days, aimed at preventing United Nations forces from reinforcing or retreating. The 38th CCF Army's assault units underwent 6 weeks of intensive training according to the plan. On October 1, the main assault force, the 340th Regiment, conducted a simulated attack exercise on Hill 386. Shortly afterward, in early October, the CCF's artillery and tank units moved into their positions. Simultaneously, logistical support, transport units, and medical stretcher teams were fully prepared and in place. To General Jiang Yonghui, the commanding officer of the 38th Army, it seemed that everything was ready for the upcoming assault. However, CCF received an unexpected disruption, a defection. Ku Chung-chau defected just at the right time. At 9 o'clock on the morning of October 2, 1952, as the mist had just begun to lift, the battlefield became visible once more. When the 7th Company of the 3rd Battalion, 340th Regiment of the 114th Division, 38th CCF Army departed from Wameni to gather at their battalion assembly point. Seizing the opportunity, the company's cultural instructor, Ku Chung-chau, quietly left the unit, heading south along a newly constructed road. He observed some tanks in Naedong at 11 a.m. By noon, Ku Chung-chau reached Lake Pangnae-ho and then turned southwest, continuing his journey along the lakeshore. At 1:30 p.m., Ku Chung-chau passed near the forward command post of the CCF's 114th Division and the 340th Regiment's command post, located around Hill 780, Komsan. He was challenged by a CCF sentry, but was allowed to pass when he presented a forged letter to the company commander, identifying himself as a messenger. By 4 p.m., Ku Chung Chau had crossed the forward edge of the CCF's main line of resistance. At 7 p.m., on the southern slope of Hill 396, Ku Chung Chau encountered Liu, the commander of his 7th Company. Liu was scouting the terrain with other officers of the 340th Regiment and instructed Ku Chung Chau to join them. At 8 p.m., Ku Chung Chau slipped away from Liu and the other CCF officers at the base of the hill. Under the cover of darkness, he cautiously made his way toward the United Nations forces' positions. At 10 p.m., he waded across the Yakuk River and hid along its banks for the night. On October 3, 1952, at 7:20 a.m. Ku Chung Chau finally reached the ROK positions near Hill 284, east of White Horse Mountain. Surrendering to Company 6 of the 2nd Battalion, 30th Regiment, 9th ROK Division, he revealed the shocking news of the imminent CCF offensive. Ku Chung Chau was taken to the bunker of the 2nd Battalion. Given the critical nature of the intelligence concerning a possible CCF offensive, just a few hours later, Lieutenant Paul Brainer of the 213th Field Artillery Battalion, stationed at the observation post on Hill 284, received a call from Major Henry House, the battalion's executive officer, instructing him to go to the Korean positions to assess the situation with the CCF prisoner. Upon arrival, Brainer witnessed Ku Chung Chau being beaten while bound. He attempted to intervene and halt the violence. However, at one point, Major Kim Chan-uk, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, drew his pistol and aimed it at Ku Chung Chau, ready to fire. Ku Chung Chau lowered his head, awaiting his fate. Through Lieutenant Brainer's persistent efforts and persuasion, Major Kim was eventually convinced. Recognizing the potential value of Ku Chung Chau as an intelligence asset, Major Kim agreed to spare him. He assigned 3 soldiers to escort Lieutenant Brainer and Ku Chung Chau away from the Korean positions and towards the American observation post. During subsequent interrogations, Ku Chung Chau claimed to be a devout Buddhist who had long been planning to escape due to the lack of religious freedom within his unit. He proceeded to provide detailed information on the imminent CCF offensive against White Horse Mountain and Arrowhead Hill, including specifics on troop deployment and unit structure. 3 days later, he provided Lieutenant Harold Lutz, the interrogation officer, with further details about his defection. He revealed that within the 38th CCF Army, there existed a secret sabotage organization known as the Rear Area Revolutionary Military Committee. This group had been established a year prior, in August 1951, and was founded by Ku Chung Chau himself along with Louis Chu, the cultural instructor of the 3rd Battalion's Mortar Company. Currently, there were at least 11 members of this clandestine group, who communicated through a single channel to ensure operational security. Within the CCF, they engaged in sabotage activities aimed at undermining the morale of CCF troops while also attempting to recruit additional defectors. Upon learning of the CCF's plans to attack White Horse Mountain, the members endorsed Ku Chung Chau's defection as a means to relay the gathered intelligence to the United Nations forces. He requested that the U.S. military include specific symbols on propaganda leaflets to be dropped over the 38th CCF Army. This way, the members of his organization would recognize that he was safe. The U.S. interrogators complied with his request and informed U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Department to handle the arrangement. Subsequently, rumors circulated that Ku Chung Chau moved to Taiwan after the Korean War concluded. As the frontline defensive force, Major General Kim Jong-ho of the 9th ROK Division reacted swiftly. He urgently convened a meeting with the regiment commanders and ordered the troops to enter a state of alert and fortification at 3 o'clock on October 4th. Simultaneously, Major General Kim ordered the 3rd Battalion of the 30th Regiment to move to the northern side of White Horse Mountain summit by 21:20 on October 3rd to support the 1st Battalion in repairing the forward outpost defenses. The 10th Company of the 3rd Battalion was assigned to reinforce the eastern front line of the summit. By 4:20 on October 4th, the ROK forces had completed emergency fortifications, including 150 bunkers, throughout the night. the 11th Company of the 3rd Battalion was left to defend the Camel Ridge and nearby high ground north of White Horse Mountain's main position. The remaining units returned to their assembly areas, with the 9th Company of the 3rd Battalion acting as the 30th Regiment's reserve. The 28th Regiment prepared for a counterattack with 2 battalions on standby at Hill 255, while the 29th Regiment continued with its current duties. Upon receiving the intelligence report, Major General Jenkins, commanding officer of the 9th U.S. Corps, immediately convened a meeting with his subordinate commanders. He prepared to mobilize artillery, tank, and engineering units to support the 9th ROK Division in their forthcoming operations. Following the receipt of intelligence, the 1st U.S. Corps made adjustments to the defensive deployments at Hill 281, Arrowhead Hill, in anticipation of a possible offensive by the 38th CCF Army. The number of defenders at Arrowhead Hill was increased from 300 to 340 personnel, and a forward observation post of the 37th U.S. Field Artillery Battalion was established to enhance artillery coordination. On October 4th, Lieutenant Calloway of the 213th U.S. Field Artillery Battalion's A Battery and his colleague Lieutenant Adams from B Battery, accompanied by their respective 3-man teams, arrived at the artillery observation posts located at Hill 284 and the summit of White Horse Mountain. They replaced the previous observation teams and became among the first to witness the CCF's offensive activities. After dusk on October 4th, apart from increased artillery fire, the front remained relatively calm. The situation on October 5th was unchanged, feared to be the calm before the storm. During this brief lull, the ROK Army strengthened their defensive positions, burying telephone lines underground. Anticipating possible flooding of the Akak River, Korean forces on White Horse Mountain stockpiled a week's worth of food and ammunition. On the evening of October 5th, Lieutenant Calloway, stationed at the artillery observation post on Hill 284, noticed that CCF mortars had begun shelling White Horse Mountain. Shortly thereafter, he observed CCF assault units moving through the valleys in front of the mountain. Reacting quickly, he called for a time-on-target TOT strike, coordinating all the artillery pieces from his unit to fire simultaneously at the designated target. After Ku Chung Chao's defection on October 2nd, General Jiang Yonghui, commanding officer of the 38th CCF Army, briefly considered either advancing or delaying the operation. However, on October 3rd, CCF headquarters issued a unified order for all units to launch their offensive on October 6th, allowing the 38th Army to finalize its own battle plan. Thus, the 38th CCF Army decided to proceed with the planned offensive on October 6th, in accordance with the orders from CCF headquarters. To achieve surprise and reduce casualties by shortening the assault distance, the 38th CCF Army planned for its assault units to infiltrate close to the front lines of the ROK Army's defensive positions on White Horse Mountain during the night of October 5th. At daybreak on October 6th, the troops were to remain hidden, and the attack would commence after dusk. On the night of October 5th, before the full moon had risen, the assault units of the 38th CCF Army began their advance. General Jiang Yonghui, along with division and regimental officers, arrived at the front to see the soldiers off. 8 companies from the 340th Regiment of the 114th Division crossed their own forward positions, moving through Sangjin-Myeongdong, Sangdong, and Hill 396. Under the cover of darkness, they quietly advanced toward White Horse Mountain from multiple directions. Once in position, the soldiers dug shallow trenches, covering themselves with grass and vegetation for camouflage. The assault force had been reinforced with 2 additional companies, nearly committing the entire 340th Regiment. At the same time, 3 battalions of the 339th Regiment of the 113th Division set off for their assault on Arrowhead Hill. Advancing southward, they deployed along Hill 431 and nearby ridges. The 1st and 3rd Battalions were responsible for the attack, while the 2nd Battalion followed behind, prepared to replace the assaulting units and take over the defense once the objectives were secured. That morning, a soldier from the signal squad of the 1st Battalion, 340th CCF Regiment, became disoriented while laying telephone lines between the battalion headquarters and the 2nd Company. he mistakenly headed south, inadvertently approaching the Republic of Korea Army's defensive perimeter. At 7:30 he was captured by a patrol unit of the 30th ROK Regiment on the western side of White Horse Mountain. His interrogation corroborated all the details of Ku Chung-chau's intelligence, confirming that the planned attack remained unchanged. However, the timing was adjusted to either the 6th or 7th of October, with the signal for the assault being 3 green flares. During the day on October 6th, both U.S. and ROK artillery intensified their bombardment of the area in front of White Horse Mountain. In the midst of this intense shelling, Lu Wan-fa, the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion of the 340th CCF Regiment, was killed. By the afternoon, as anticipated, the volunteer forces opened the sluice gates at the Lake Pang Ho to release water, signaling that an attack would commence in a few hours. However, the water level of the Yakuk River only rose by 0.5 to 1.5 meters overall, which did not significantly impact the UN forces' troop movements and supply lines. As daylight waned, the concealed CCF troops waited quietly for the signal to launch their assault. Their adversaries, the soldiers of the 9th ROK Division, nervously clutched their fully loaded rifles in their trenches, bracing for the impending battle. By the evening of October 6, the 9th ROK Division had a total of 12,589 personnel, including 1 artillery battalion. Additionally, the division was supported by the 51st Regiment with 3,162 men, the 1st Artillery Group, which comprised 2 artillery battalions totaling 1,341 personnel, and the 53rd Tank Company with 171 men. They were further backed by several thousand UN forces artillery and tank troops, contributing to the defensive strength. On October 6 at 18:30, the waiting was over. The moment had arrived for the planned offensive. The CCF troops, concealed and ready, prepared to launch their assault under the cover of darkness. The tension was palpable as both sides awaited the impending clash. Signal flares rose into the northern sky. This flash marked the beginning of the offensive by the CCF troops, signaling the start of the fierce battle to come. The artillery of the CCF began a rapid bombardment, with thousands of shells raining down on the positions held by the defenders on White Horse Mountain and Arrowhead Hill. In particular, the positions of the ROK 11th Company on the Camel Ridge to the north of White Horse Mountain and the ROK 10th Company on the eastern side of the summit were subjected to concentrated artillery fire. During the bombardment, more than half of the defensive fortifications of the Korean 11th Company were destroyed. The CCF's assault troops launched attacks from 5 directions, focusing on the gap between the Korean 11th Company to the north and the 10th and 3rd Companies, with the aim of capturing both the summit and the northern positions in one decisive push. The CCF assault teams used Bangalore torpedo to clear paths through barbed wire and minefields, continuing their advance relentlessly. On the summit of White Horse Mountain, Lieutenant Adams of the U.S. Artillery Forward Observation Post received a report about a CCF assault in the valley and contacted Lieutenant Calloway for assistance. With a superior vantage point at the Hill 284 observation post, Calloway immediately requested illumination flares. The eastern side of White Horse Mountain was lit up as bright as day. Through a 20x telescope, Calloway observed the Chinese troops attacking in waves like ripened grain and promptly requested artillery support. Very soon, Lieutenant Adams on White Horse Mountain heard the sound of rifle fire. Between 1915 and 1930, the CCF assault units approaching from the north and west neared the front lines of the Korean Army's positions on White Horse Mountain. The Korean 11th Company was the first to engage, unleashing all types of light and heavy weapons. Heavy machine gun emplacements fired continuous bursts of bullets, with some shots striking the advancing Chinese troops as they charged forward. The ROK Army had also placed burning gasoline drums on the slopes to illuminate the advancing Chinese troops. At the same time, the commander of the 3rd Company reported that on the eastern side of White Horse Mountain, waves of Chinese soldiers were surging forward in dense formations. The enemy, though dispersed, appeared as a solid mass as they moved uphill. The Koreans continuously fired illumination flares, and under the bright light, the 10th and 3rd Companies focused their fire on the advancing Chinese forces, inflicting heavy casualties. By 2015, the CCF assault units began to pull back slightly from their positions. After a brief pause, the 340th CCF Regiment regrouped and launched a renewed, full-scale assault with all their remaining strength. CCF concentrated their assault forces on the positions held by the 10th and 3rd Companies of the 30th ROK Regiment. These defensive positions had been damaged and had not yet been fully repaired, making them vulnerable to the renewed attack. A fierce gunfight erupted between the two sides, with vanguard soldiers hurling grenades at one another in close combat. Major Kim Young-seon, the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment, ordered the mortar platoon to concentrate its fire on the front lines of the defensive positions, intensifying the barrage against the advancing Chinese forces. To support the defense of the 30th ROK Regiment, the 53rd ROK Tank Company, positioned on Cheongmasan, began firing directly at the Chinese assault formations, targeting the attacking clusters with precision. The 3rd Platoon of the 86th U.S. Engineer Searchlight Company activated their searchlights, providing continuous illumination for the tanks and artillery, aiding in their efforts to target the advancing Chinese forces. On Hill 278, Company C of the 73rd U.S. Tank Battalion activated their tank-mounted searchlights, continuously aiming and firing at the Chinese forces from the left flank of White Horse Mountain. By 2200 hours, after intense fighting, CCF finally broke through the main line of resistance of the Korean forces, pushing into the gap between the 3rd and 10th Companies of the 30th ROK Regiment. Following the breakthrough, the Chinese forces engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat with the 2nd and 3rd Platoons of the Korean 10th Company, which had arrived to reinforce the defense. After repelling the Korean troops, a squad-sized Chinese unit captured an observation post. They used the existing fortifications to hold their position, facing off against the ROK forces while awaiting reinforcements. The Korean 10th Company, having suffered heavy losses, received orders from the 1st Battalion commander to withdraw to the southern end of the high ground. The breakthrough acted as a wedge into the Korean main defenses, causing significant instability across the front line. Observing the deteriorating situation, Colonel Park Ik-sun, the commanding officer of the 30th ROK Regiment, responded by dispatching the reserve 9th Company to counterattack. The 9th Company, moving from the Hill 255 and crossing the Yakuk Valley River, launched an assault on the CCF positions, supported by the regiment's artillery. The CCF forces, aware of the Korean counterattack, reported the situation to their command. They, in turn, received artillery support that enabled them to repel the Korean 9th Company's efforts. In response to the escalating situation, Major General Kim Jong-ho, the commanding officer of the 9th ROK Division, quickly mobilized the division's reserve forces, including the 28th ROK Regiment's 1st Battalion and Reconnaissance Company, to reinforce the 30th ROK Regiment. Between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, these reinforcements crossed the Yakuk Valley River via the Loyalty Bridge, arriving at the attack initiation line. Additionally, the 2nd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment was positioned at the Hill 255 to provide further support. The division's artillery focused its firepower on the CCF positions to regain control of the situation. As the battle intensified, the 28th ROK Regiment's 1st Battalion, with its 1st Company on the right flank, advanced along the steep slopes, systematically eliminating the CCF's fire positions. The 2nd Company, positioned on the left flank, launched a rapid assault, while the 3rd Company acted as a reserve force, waiting to support as needed. In a fierce struggle for every inch of ground, the 340th CCF Regiment was pushed back by the Korean forces. Additionally, the Korean 11th Company, which was defending the Camel Ridge, along with other Korean troops stationed on the main peak, successfully repelled this wave of CCF attacks. The CCF regrouped and launched a 3rd assault. After a 10-minute artillery preparation, firing approximately 1,000 shells, the CCF forces began their attack at 040 from multiple directions, focusing on the protruding Camel Ridge. They aimed to sever the connection between the Korean forces stationed on Camel Ridge and those on the main peak. Fierce fighting erupted once again. The Korean 1st Artillery Group, supported by American artillery, carried out a heavy barrage in front of the Korean positions. By 2 o'clock, 38th CCF Army Commander Jeon Yong-hui committed the 342nd CCF Regiment's 2nd Battalion to battle, targeting the positions of the Korean 1st and 2nd Companies on the left flank, as well as the positions of the 11th Company on Camel Ridge. The CCF artillery delivered a devastating bombardment, destroying almost all of the Koreans' trenches. In the ensuing chaos, amidst a storm of hand grenades and crossfire, both sides engaged in a fierce and bloody struggle. Lieutenant Calloway, stationed at the observation post, monitored the battle on White Horse Mountain while guiding continuous American artillery fire. On one occasion, he observed CCF troops storming a Korean machine gun bunker. The machine gun was seized 3 times by the advancing CCF troops, only to be reclaimed each time by Korean gunners who had chased them away, using carbines to repel and kill the attackers. By 5:10, the CCF began to retreat, but they constructed defensive positions in front of the Korean positions and continued to face off against the Koreans. On the first day of the battle, General Jeon Yong-hui had already committed 11 companies. Despite thorough preparations by the 38th CCF Army, the leak of attack plans had allowed the Koreans to reinforce their defenses and prepare for counterattacks. The firepower was intense, with artillery fire effectively blocking the CCF's advance. American artillery utilized proximity fuses, causing shells to explode at various heights between 3 to over 10 meters above the ground. The shrapnel caused severe casualties among the advancing CCF troops, even hitting those in trenches at times. Illumination flares were continuously fired every 10 minutes to help American and Korean artillery locate targets and to prevent soldiers from becoming anxious during the night. General Jeon Yong-hui believed that these factors were causing the assault troops' progress to be very slow. Some units even attacked in the wrong direction and suffered heavy casualties from artillery fire, preventing them from approaching the ROK positions as planned. As the 340th CCF Regiment launched its general assault on White Horse Mountain, following an intense artillery preparation, the 339th CCF Regiment also began its attack on the French positions at Hill 281, Arrowhead Hill, starting just after 1830. The CCF's strategy for this assault was to conduct a pincer movement, attacking the French positions simultaneously from the west and north. The 1st Battalion 2nd and 3rd Companies advanced from the Hill 252, crossing the valley to launch an attack from the west against the French positions. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion approached from the north to execute a phased attack on the northern side of the French positions. The 7th Company's 3rd Platoon and the 9th Company's 1st Platoon formed the initial assault wave, followed by the 9th Company's 2nd and 3rd Platoons. The 8th Company and the 7th Company's 1st and 2nd Platoons were stationed a few kilometers away, ready to provide support as needed. Before the battle commenced, the French battalion had dispatched reinforcements to support Company N, which was defending the positions on Arrowhead Hill. These reinforcements included the Pioneer Platoon and a provisional platoon made up of personnel drawn from the battalion headquarters company. The French Pioneer Platoon was regarded as one of the most elite units in the French forces, what the French would call the cream of the cream. In addition to their engineering duties, they also specialized in for long-range patrols and close-in fighting, making them a versatile and formidable force on the battlefield. The 2 forward outposts, manned by the French Pioneer Platoon, were located on the western and northern slopes of Arrowhead Hill, placing them directly in the path of the CCF's assault. The western outpost was commanded by Lieutenant Perron, while the northern outpost was led by Sergeant Gavriloff. The CCF demolition teams blasted through the defensive fortifications, creating openings. Once the paths were cleared, assault squads surged forward, launching a direct attack on the French positions. Artillery shells crisscrossed the battlefield as both sides engaged in fierce firefights with light and heavy weapons at the front lines. The intense battle remained locked in a tense stalemate. At 1910, Lieutenant Colonel Borel, the commander of the French battalion, requested artillery support from the U.S. forces to protect the forward outposts under heavy assault. At 1915, Colonel Stilwell, commander of the 23rd Regiment, 2nd U.S. Division, assigned Company K of the 3rd Battalion to the French battalion, positioning them near Hill 226 as a reserve force on standby. Shortly after, communication with Lieutenant Perron's forward outpost was lost. After 1930, CCF forces stormed the French forward outpost, leading to brutal hand-to-hand combat between the two sides. A few minutes later, Sergeant Gavriloff at the other outpost sent his final radio message to Colonel Borel. He told the colonel not to worry and that they would hold out. When Perron's position was overrun, he joined Gavriloff by making his way up a trench the Chinese had not yet found. The fiercest hand-to-hand fighting was taking place. Perron saw Gavriloff roll down the hill with a Chinese and stagger back up a few inches later with a bloody trench knife in his hand. Lieutenant Perron was wounded 5 times and lost consciousness twice in the battle. Gavriloff was KIA. At 1955, the positions of French companies O and P, located between White Horse Mountain and Arrowhead Hill, came under attack from CCF forces. It is believed that part of the 1st Battalion, 340th ROK Regiment, originally tasked with attacking White Horse Mountain, had mistakenly advanced in the wrong direction. By 2045, the CCF had captured the 2 French forward outposts. The French Pioneer Platoon suffered heavy casualties, with 22 killed and 17 wounded. Following this, the CCF began a direct assault on Company N's main position on Arrowhead Mountain. By 2140, under pressure from a French counterattack, the CCF forces retreated slightly and began constructing positions near the French front lines. At 2200 hours, the CCF committed additional forces, launching a full-scale assault from the north. Despite the relentless attacks, the French troops tenaciously defended their positions, repelling the CCF by 2300 hours. In the early hours of October 7th, at 1 o'clock, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 339th CCF Regiment fully engaged in the battle, launching an all-out assault on the French positions at Arrowhead Hill. Under the command of Major Decisive, the French Company N fiercely resisted the waves of CCF soldiers flooding their defenses. At the same time, U.S. Company K arrived on the high ground to provide reinforcements. The support also included a provisional platoon composed of personnel from the French battalion's trains, a platoon from Company O, and a platoon from the battalion's heavy weapons company. Additionally, the 23rd U.S. Regiment's tank company dispatched 2 tanks, which were deployed on the left flank, continuously firing on the attacking CCF forces. By now, around 500 troops were defending the main position on Arrowhead Hill. After nearly 2 hours of brutal close-quarters combat, the French forces finally repelled the CCF assault at 2:45. At 6:28, the French launched a counterattack in an attempt to retake the 2 forward outposts, but were forced to retreat due to heavy CCF artillery fire. Throughout the intense fighting on Arrowhead Hill, the U.S. Artillery Forward Observation Post, led by Lieutenant Woods, continuously called for fire support from the 2nd U.S. Division's artillery. When they discovered that a French heavy machine gunner had been killed, Sergeant Tom Miller, along with a fellow, took over the heavy machine gun position, joining the defense of the stronghold. The artillery of the 2nd Division roared without pause. Between 1900 hours on October 6th and 0700 on October 7th, a total of 20,199 howitzer rounds were fired in support of the defense. As daylight broke, the intensity of the battle began to subside. By the end of the first day of fighting, the 339th Regiment of the 113th CCF Division had committed 6 companies to the assault. Although less than 12 hours had passed, the CCF units had already suffered significant casualties. For example, in the 2nd Platoon of the 2nd Company, 1st Battalion, Squad 6, 3 were killed, and 7 were wounded. In the 1st Platoon of the 3rd Company, Squad 3, 1 soldier was killed and 3 were wounded. The first wave of the 3rd Battalion's assault force saw approximately 1/3 killed and another third wounded. As a result, the 339th CCF Regiment's attack power was significantly diminished starting on the 2nd day. On the evening of October 7, at 23:23, the CCF launched another assault on Arrowhead Hill. After about an hour of fierce fighting, the attack was repelled. Over the next few days, the CCF only conducted probing attacks against the positions of the three French companies. Beginning on October 8, 2nd U.S. Division Artillery, directed by the American observation post on Arrowhead Hill, shifted to support the defense of the 9th ROK Division on the right flank. Now, let's return to White Horse Mountain. The battle for White Horse Mountain continued fiercely, with both sides locked in a tense standoff. That morning, several high-ranking U.S. officers visited the headquarters of the 9th ROK Division. Among them were Major General Jenkins, commanding officer of the U.S. 9th Corps, General Van Fleet, commanding officer of the U.S. 8th Army, Brigadier General Adams, the Chief of Staff, and Lieutenant General Barkas, commanding officer of the 5th Air Force. They met with Major General Kim Jong-ho, commanding officer of the 9th ROK Division, and Colonel Sellers, the senior U.S. advisor, to assess the results of the previous night's battle. Pleased with the minimal casualties suffered by the ROK forces during the CCF artillery barrage, they expressed satisfaction with the efforts to reinforce the defensive fortifications prior to the attack. The U.S. officers also commended the outstanding performance of the artillery units under the command of Brigadier General Colburn and the tank units led by Lieutenant Colonel Gibson of the 73rd U.S. Tank Battalion. Over the following days, these high-level commanders frequently visited the 9th ROK Division headquarters to coordinate strategy. At noon, Major General Kim Jong-ho ordered the 30th ROK Regiment to deploy its reserve forces in a counterattack, targeting the CCF positions near Cheongsong-dong on the western side of the main peak. The 30th ROK Regiment deployed the 9th Company, which advanced past the 2nd Company on the left flank, while the 10th Company moved past the 3rd Company on the right flank. At 1400 hours, they launched a coordinated counterattack against the CCF positions. The CCF had anticipated a counterattack by the ROK forces during the day and had prepared their fire support in advance. As soon as the Koreans launched their assault, they were immediately hit by heavy artillery fire and intense machine gun fire from well-positioned CCF defenses. On the right flank, the 10th Company advanced past the summit but quickly found itself caught in a deadly crossfire, forcing it to retreat. On the left, the 9th Company also faced withering artillery and machine gun fire from the CCF. Despite receiving supporting fire from both U.S. and Korean artillery, the 9th Company was unable to advance beyond 30 meters from the CCF positions. By 1755, both companies of the Korean counterattack force were forced to withdraw. At the same time, around 1530, the CCF organized another company-sized assault, launching a coordinated attack on the Korean 11th Company. Camel Ridge, which featured 3 distinct hilltops, was defended by the 11th Company, with each hilltop garrisoned by a separate unit, forming independent circular defenses. The CCF concentrated their artillery fire on the positions of the Korean 11th Company, relentlessly bombarding the area until nearly all fortifications were destroyed. At the same time, CCF assault units launched their attack. Despite fierce resistance from the ROK forces, bolstered by support from the U.S. Air Force, the CCF's offensive proved unstoppable. The 11th Company was eventually fully encircled. By 1700 hours, the CCF had successfully captured Camel Ridge. The remaining soldiers of the Korean 11th Company, now surrounded, continued to hold out until the early morning of October 8, at 3 o'clock. Lieutenant Lee Song-deok, the platoon leader of the 11th Company, led his soldiers in a breakout attempt. Around 40 men successfully made it back to the Korean lines. During the escape, Lee was struck by shrapnel in the head and was killed. For his bravery in leading the breakout, he was posthumously awarded the Yulji Order of Military Merit. The tide of the battle began to turn in favor of the CCF. Determined to seize the summit of White Horse Mountain and drive the South Korean forces from the southern slopes, General Jeong Yong-hui, commanding officer of the 38th CCF Army, continued to escalate the offensive. After dusk, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 342nd CCF Regiment were committed to the attack on the main peak. After the loss of Camel Ridge, U.S. and ROK artillery concentrated their firepower on the CCF forces now occupying the area. Despite heavy bombardment, the CCF assault units pressed forward, disregarding casualties, and launched an all-out attack on the ROK positions on the summit. At 1920, the CCF launched a full-scale assault in 4 directions, targeting the main defensive positions. By 2120, a CCF battalion advanced from Camel Ridge, launching a ferocious attack on the positions of the 1st Battalion, 30th ROK Regiment, at the summit of White Horse Mountain. At 2200 hours, the CCF finally broke through the ROK defenses. The 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment was forced to retreat, joining the 1st Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment in occupying positions south of the summit. Shortly thereafter, U.S. 9th Corps received a report from the 9th ROK Division that White Horse Mountain had fallen. During the retreat, the commander of the Korean 1st Company, along with a signaler, sprinted through the trenches, instructing the troops to fall back. Suddenly, a shell exploded nearby, severing the signaler's left arm. In shock, he continued to mechanically call for support over the radio. "Headquarters, this is the 1st Company. Can you hear me?" There was no response. The damaged radio hung uselessly on his back. The 1st Company commander grabbed the signaler by the collar, shouting, "Your war is over," and then pulled him down the slope, away from the chaos of the battlefield. Another shell struck the U.S. artillery observation post, its massive explosion ripping through the bunker's surface. Inside, Corporal Augustin, with his radio headset on, was frantically calling for fire support. A direct hit on one side of the bunker sent everyone crashing to the ground under the shockwave. Lieutenant Adams and Sergeant Oxendale crawled over to assess the damage, only to find that radio communication had been cut off, and the phone lines were dead. They had temporarily lost all contact with the 213th U.S. Field Artillery Battalion's Fire Command Center. As the sounds of battle grew more distant and the explosions of grenades faded, the men inside the bunker were left uncertain of the situation outside. However, they knew their fight for survival was about to begin. Meanwhile, due to heavy casualties sustained in the fighting, the CCF, having captured the summit, lacked the strength to push further south. General Jian Yonghui, commanding officer of the 38th CCF Army, ordered the 342nd Regiment to fortify their positions on the summit, preparing for an anticipated counterattack by Korean forces. The 3rd Battalion of the 340th CCF Regiment had suffered heavy casualties, with losses reaching 450 men. Among them, the 8th Company alone had approximately 140 soldiers killed. The CCF, while making use of some bunkers, largely avoided using the defensive fortifications left behind by the ROK forces. Instead, they dug their own foxholes. The reason was simple: the Korean troops were highly familiar with the positions of their former fortifications, and if the CCF occupied them, they would be easy targets for U.S. and ROK artillery. At the entrance of the U.S. artillery observation post, Lieutenant Adams surveyed the situation under the light of illumination flares. Armed with a carbine, he crouched low and advanced along the bottom of a trench for several dozen meters. Just as he lifted his head over the edge of the trench to get a better view, a bullet struck the back of his helmet, knocking it off into the trench. The impact threw him to the ground, his face filled with dirt. Within a second or two, Adams regained his senses, quickly grabbed his helmet from a short distance away, and, after putting it back on, rushed back toward his bunker. Behind him, the sound of shouting, rifle fire, and the rattling bursts of a PPSH submachine gun echoed in the distance. As Adams reached the observation post, 3 U.S. soldiers retreated from the outer section of the bunker to the inner section, using sandbags to block the entrance. CCF soldiers arrived at the bunker's entrance and launched an attack. Fortunately, barbed wire stopped the first grenade they threw. Both sides exchanged fire and hurled grenades, with explosions rocking the outer layer of the bunker continuously. Major General Kim Jong-ho, commanding officer of the 9th ROK Division, ordered the 28th Regiment to launch a counterattack and retake the summit of White Horse Mountain. the 1st Battalion of the 30th Regiment was assigned to the 28th Regiment, and the 53rd Tank Company was also placed under the regiment's command. Colonel Lee Juil, commanding officer of the 28th ROK Regiment, ordered the 2nd Battalion to advance on the right flank, while the 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment advanced on the left, both targeting the summit. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment was ordered to move from Toxidangani to assemble at Hill 255. Inside the observation post on the White Horse Mountain, the Americans continued to hold out. Suddenly, radio communication was restored. Lieutenant Adams' frantic voice came through the radio at the 213th U.S. Field Artillery Battalion's Fire Command Center. "They're everywhere, CCF soldiers are surrounding us. Start firing on my position." Immediately, Lieutenant Colonel Humphrey, the commanding officer of the battalion, ordered the entire battalion to fire on the observation post. He also requested support from Battery B of the 17th U.S. Field Artillery Battalion and ROK Artillery, with the barrage directed by Lieutenant Calloway's observation post. In short order, the first volley of 18 155mm shells, equipped with proximity fuses, exploded in mid-air near the U.S. observation post on White Horse Mountain. Wave after wave of shells followed, crashing around the summit of White Horse Mountain. The shockwaves from the explosions reverberated through the sandbags and wooden beams of the bunker, causing the earth to rain down inside and filling the air with thick dust. Occasionally, after an explosion, the faint sound of agonizing screams could be heard from outside the bunker, only to be abruptly silenced by the next detonation. Between fits of coughing, Lieutenant Adams shouted, "How many shells are they going to fire?" Several hours later, Lieutenant Adams was finally relieved and evacuated from White Horse Mountain. He was transferred to the observation post codenamed Item on Hill 278, where he remained until the battle concluded. The battle between South Korean and CCF forces turned into a prolonged and fierce tug-of-war. Both sides concentrated their artillery fire on the area south of the summit, reducing the landscape to a scorched wasteland. At 0:45 on October 8, the 2nd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment crossed the defensive line south of White Horse Mountain summit. The 5th and 6th Companies formed the 1st Assault Wave, with the 7th Company and Reconnaissance Company following as reserves. Taking advantage of a lull in CCF fire, the 5th Company led the charge, breaking through the positions of the 342nd CCF Regiment. The entire 2nd Battalion seized the moment and launched a coordinated assault, successfully recapturing the summit by 2:40. The 6th Company and Reconnaissance Unit pursued the retreating CCF forces up to Camel Ridge but were pushed back and returned to their forward positions at the summit. At the same time, the 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment repelled the CCF and reclaimed the western positions of the summit. At this point, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 28th ROK Regiment, along with the 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment, established control over the main positions with the summit at the center. The 3rd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment withdrew to the Toxidangani to regroup and resupply. On October 8, as morning fog rolled in, the 342nd CCF Regiment launched a surprise assault on the forward positions of the main peak. This led to intense close-quarters combat with the ROK forces. At 8:10, a friendly fire incident occurred when the American Air Force accidentally bombed the Korean positions, causing chaos and forcing the 5th and 6th Companies to retreat. The CCF recaptured the main peak for the second time. That afternoon, the 3rd Battalion of the 342nd Regiment consolidated their hold on the main peak and began pushing further south. Meanwhile, 2nd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment struggled to hold their positions south of the main peak. At noon, Major General Kim Jong-ho ordered the 3rd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment to launch a counterattack, while the 3rd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment moved to Hill 255 as a reserve force. Consequently, the 3rd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment advanced from Hill 255 and deployed at the southern end of the Hill 395. At 1700 hours, the ROK counterattack forces advanced, moving past the 2nd Battalion's defensive line to strike at the CCF positions. the 53rd ROK Tank Company had 2 platoons positioned on the eastern side of the main peak, targeting CCF machine gun emplacements. Simultaneously, the U.S. Air Force deployed dozens of sorties of fighter bombers, which dropped bombs, napalm, and strafed the CCF positions around the summit of White Horse Mountain. As the Korean forces mounted their counteroffensive, Sun Chang-gang, commanding officer of the 1st Company, 1st Battalion of the 342nd CCF Regiment, called for artillery support via field telephone upon noticing the Korean advance. Once again, smoke and fire enveloped the southern slopes of Hill 395. Under the cover of supporting fire, the Korean 3rd Battalion launched a fierce assault, advancing toward the summit by 2000 hours. Meanwhile, the 5th and 6th Companies of the 2nd Battalion attacked the left flank of the main peak. At 2045, the 9th and 11th Companies of the Korean 3rd Battalion broke through into the main peak positions on White Horse Mountain, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat with the 1st Battalion of the 342nd CCF Regiment, which was defending the summit. The fierce battle raged until 2200 hours, when the 10th Company of the 3rd Battalion, supported by reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion, successfully recaptured and secured the summit. Major General Kim Jong-il immediately ordered the 3rd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment to advance from Hill 255 to a position 1 kilometer southeast of the summit. Coordinating with the 1st Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment on the right flank, they managed to push back the CCF forces by 2245. Meanwhile, on the left flank, the 1st Battalion of the 30th Regiment also forced the CCF to retreat. With pressure on both flanks easing, the Korean 3rd Battalion continued their assault northward. Facing heavy casualties, the CCF was forced to withdraw from the areas surrounding the summit of Hill 395. Recognizing the heavy losses sustained by the 9th ROK Division after days of continuous fighting, Major General Kim Jong-il determined that both the 28th and 30th Regiments were in urgent need of resupply and reorganization. To support the next phase of the counteroffensive, he immediately redeployed the division's right flank reserve, the 29th ROK Regiment, to assemble at Hill 255 and prepare for further attacks. Simultaneously, the 51st ROK Regiment was tasked with replacing the 29th ROK Regiment's original defensive positions. The 1st Battalion was positioned on the left flank, while the 2nd Battalion took up the right, coordinating with the 7th U.S. Infantry Division on their right side. The 3rd Battalion was held in reserve. The battle for control of Hill 395 intensified as both the Korean and Chinese forces fought fiercely for dominance. General Jiang Yonghui, commanding officer of the 38th CCF Army, ordered the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 334th Regiment from the 112th CCF Division to launch a full-scale assault on the Korean positions at 1 o'clock on October 9. The 334th CCF Regiment's troops advanced swiftly and powerfully, launching 2 waves of attacks. By 3 o'clock, after fierce hand-to-hand combat, they broke through the defenses of the 10th Company, 3rd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment, capturing the summit of White Horse Mountain for the 3rd time. The CCF forces then launched attacks on the flanks of the Korean positions, attempting to expand their gains. On both flanks, the 1st Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment suffered consecutive defeats, forcing them to retreat. The remaining forces regrouped with the 3rd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment, which had already fallen back, to defend the southern line of White Horse Mountain. General Jiang Yonghui ordered the 334th CCF Regiment to pull back, handing over the defense of the main peak to the 342nd Regiment under the command of Zhu Jieli. Zhu's forces were tasked with holding the critical summit positions on Hill 395. At the village of Sahudong near the Akuk River, the 28th ROK Regiment gathered several hundred scattered soldiers, hastily organizing them into a counterattack force. At 6:50, they launched a counteroffensive, engaging the CCF forces in a fierce battle on the slopes of White Horse Mountain. By 9:30, the 2nd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment, having resupplied and reorganized, joined the counterattack. Both sides' artillery unleashed thousands of shells on the area south of the summit. To strengthen the flanks, the 3rd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment handed over its positions to the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 28th ROK Regiment before moving to reinforce the left flank alongside the 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment. That day, the U.S. 5th Air Force intensified its air support, with fighter bombers delivering powerful strikes. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted a CCF regiment-sized formation gathering on the southern slope of Hyeonsong San, and immediately launched repeated airstrikes. Later, CCF prisoners revealed that the formation likely belonged to the 335th Regiment of the 112th CCF Division, which had suffered heavy casualties during the bombing. Determined to reclaim Whitehorse Mountain, Major General Kim Jong-ho, commanding officer of the 9th ROK Division, resolved to commit the reserve 29th Regiment to lead a counteroffensive, with support from the 28th Regiment. The 1st Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment reached the attack line at Hill 266, south of the Okok River, by 9 o'clock, while the 3rd Battalion arrived at Hill 255, southeast of the Hill 395, by 8:40. Between 10 o'clock and 12:55, the U.S. Air Force carried out 5 airstrikes on the CCF positions atop the summit, dropping at least 60 napalm bombs. At 12 o'clock, the 3rd Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment took up positions on the right flank alongside the 28th ROK Regiment, while the 1st Battalion aligned on the left flank with the 30th ROK Regiment. At 14:05, as supporting artillery fire advanced, both battalions launched a coordinated assault. The 3rd Battalion deployed all 3 of its companies, with the 9th Company on the left, the 10th Company in the center, and the 11th Company on the right. CCF resistance proved weaker than expected, with their artillery lacking intensity and precision. After 2 hours of fighting, the Korean forces captured several hills southeast of the summit. After dusk, General Jeon Young-hui, commanding officer of the CCF 38th Army, ordered the 3rd Battalion of the 334th Regiment, 112th CCF Division, to take over the defense of the summit from the 342nd Regiment. However, 2 companies from the 3rd Battalion of the 342nd Regiment remained on the battlefield, continuing to fight despite the shift in responsibility. During the defensive operations, the 342nd CCF Regiment had suffered heavy casualties. For example, the 9th Company of the 342nd CCF Regiment suffered an estimated 80% casualties. In the 1st platoon alone, 15 soldiers were killed, including the squad leader of the 3rd Squad. Additionally, 15 others were wounded, including the platoon leader, as well as the 1st and 2nd Squad leaders. The 2nd platoon also sustained heavy losses, with 26 either killed or wounded. At 2300 hours, fierce combat erupted once again at the summit of the Hill 395, with both sides engaging in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The Korean forces launched 4 consecutive assaults, all of which were repelled by the CCF, who utilized heavy machine gun and mortar fire to hold their positions. By 0:30 on October 10th, the Koreans mounted a 5th assault and finally succeeded in capturing the summit. However, the battle raged on, with artillery from both sides relentlessly shelling the summit and the surrounding areas. At the same time, Company C of the 73rd U.S. Tank Battalion provided support, bombarding the CCF forces on the western slopes of Whitehorse Mountain. In the intense exchange of fire, 1 tank was hit and caught fire, wounding 1 crew member. Despite the damage, the flames were extinguished, and the tank was able to return to operation. Major General Kim Jong-ho made further adjustments to the battle lines, ordering the 2nd Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment to quickly move to Hill 255 in preparation for a counteroffensive. Thick fog covered Whitehorse Mountain as the 342nd CCF Regiment, having regrouped, launched an attack at 3:30 on October 10th, advancing toward the summit. The 1st Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment fiercely resisted, engaging in close-quarters combat, but by around 4 o'clock, they were forced to withdraw from the summit. After regrouping, the Korean forces prepared for a counterattack. Colonel Kim Bong-cheol, the commanding officer of the 29th ROK Regiment, ordered the 2nd Battalion into action, with the 7th Company reinforcing the 3rd Battalion while the rest of the battalion moved toward the 1st Battalion's positions. At 6:30, the 1st Battalion successfully retook Hill 395, with the 2nd Battalion fortifying the position. Meanwhile, Major General Kim Jong-ho ordered the 3rd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment to regroup and resupply at Isan-ni. Colonel Kim Bong-cheol then commanded his troops to repair the fortifications and strengthen their defenses. However, just as the Koreans were reinforcing their lines, the CCF launched another assault. At 8 o'clock, the CCF launched another assault on the ROK positions atop White Horse Mountain, deploying the 3rd Battalions of both the 334th and 342nd CCF regiments. The CCF's artillery barrage was exceptionally intense, reducing the fortifications to rubble. Taking advantage of the destruction, the CCF forces pressed their attack. On the summit, the 3rd Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment, alongside the 7th Company of the 2nd Battalion, fought back fiercely, hurling grenades and engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Amid the thick smoke and chaos of the battlefield, Korean forces suffered heavy casualties and could no longer hold their ground. By 8:15, both the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 29th ROK Regiment were forced to withdraw from the summit positions. Once again, the main peak of White Horse Mountain fell into the hands of the CCF. Amid pauses in the CCF artillery barrage, the battalion commanders of the 29th ROK Regiment's 2nd and 3rd Battalions decided to launch a counteroffensive. Forming an assault force based on the 7th, 9th, and 10th Companies, they initiated 3 consecutive assaults starting at 10:30, but each attempt was repelled by the CCF forces entrenched on the summit. At noon, Colonel Kim Bong-cheol, the commanding officer of the 29th ROK Regiment, ordered the 2nd and 3rd Battalions to organize a special assault team to retake Hill 395. The 2 battalion commanders assembled a team by selecting 10 soldiers from each of the 6th, 7th, 9th, 10th, and 11th Companies. After midday, U.S. aircraft once again dropped large quantities of napalm bombs on the CCF positions. At 13:20, the special assault team reached the summit and successfully recaptured the peak. The main force of the 29th ROK Regiment quickly moved up in support, with the 11th Company pursuing the CCF forces as far as 300 meters north of the summit. At midday, the 9th ROK Division adjusted its defensive positions. The 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment was sent to Hill 255 to regroup and resupply, with the Reconnaissance Company taking over its former position. By 20:30 that day, the 2nd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment also moved near Hill 255, handing over its original position to the 2nd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment. The entire 30th ROK Regiment was now assembled together near Hill 255, standing by for further orders. At 15:20, the 2nd Battalion of the 334th CCF Regiment launched an assault on the Korean positions atop White Horse Mountain. After 2.5 hours of intense fighting, the 7th Company of the 29th ROK Regiment's 2nd Battalion was forced to retreat, prompting the 3rd Battalion to send reinforcements. By 19:30, the Korean forces could no longer hold their positions, and all 3 battalions of the 29th ROK Regiment withdrew. After the CCF forces captured the summit, the 3rd Battalion of the 334th CCF Regiment pushed beyond the peak, launching further attacks on the Korean defenses. At 20:30, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 29th ROK Regiment counterattacked, regaining control and consolidating their positions. However, during the battle, Major Kim Kyung-jin, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, was killed by artillery fire at his command post, with his signaller. For his bravery, Major Kim was posthumously awarded the Taegyuk Order of Military Merit. The 2nd Battalion came under the command of newly appointed Captain Park Young-guk. By 2250, the 1st Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment had taken positions 600 to 700 meters southwest of the summit of White Horse Mountain, while the 3rd Battalion was stationed 500 meters southeast of the summit, and the 2nd Battalion was positioned 900 to 1,000 meters from the peak, regrouping scattered troops. The 2nd Battalion resupplied its forces with ammunition, and at 23:20, the 6th and 7th Companies launched a counterattack against the CCF forces holding the summit. However, the CCF repelled the assault using machine guns and grenades. At the same time, a CCF night raid on the Korean left flank was thwarted by the 29th ROK Regiment and the Reconnaissance Company. To bolster the strength of the 29th ROK Regiment, the 2nd Company, previously defending Hill 391, was ordered to Hill 255 by 150 to serve as the regimental reserve. By this day, White Horse Mountain had become a veritable meat grinder, as fierce battles between the two armies raged on. Neither side hesitated to throw more troops into the fight for control of the summit. Since the early hours of the day, the summit had changed hands 6 times. Since the beginning of the battle, the 9th ROK Division had sustained heavy casualties. The original system for replenishing combat personnel, which required 3 to 5 days to deploy new recruits, proved too slow to keep pace with the rapidly changing battlefield conditions. To maintain the combat effectiveness of the 9th ROK Division, the 9th Corps devised a plan on October 8 to swiftly reinforce the division with fresh troops. The ROK Army Headquarters took charge of urgently airlifting recruits from training facilities. By the evening of October 9, both the 28th and 30th Regiments of the 9th ROK Division had each suffered a loss of 500 soldiers, prompting the need for immediate replacements. On the morning of October 10, 800 new recruits arrived, followed by another 200 that night. From this point on, the Korean forces began to receive a steady flow of reinforcements just 1 day after reporting casualties. This rapid replenishment of troops played a critical role in maintaining and enhancing the combat effectiveness of the ROK Army. However, after the war, the Korean military reflected on this strategy. They concluded that deploying inexperienced recruits into the intense and repeated battles, like those at White Horse Mountain, often resulted in them becoming little more than cannon fodder. That same day at 2000 hours, the 2nd Battalion, 9th Regiment of 2nd U.S. Division, launched a diversionary raid on CCF forward positions south of T-Bone Hill, aiming to distract and split the CCF's attention. However, the raid was quickly repelled by CCF forces. At 3 o'clock, a CCF battalion launched an assault on the positions of the 28th ROK Regiment south of the summit. After an hour and a half of intense fighting, the CCF forces were repelled. In response, the 9th ROK Division initiated a full-scale counteroffensive. At 5 o'clock, the 28th ROK Regiment deployed 3 platoons from the 5th and 6th Companies to Hill 245, tasked with a diversionary attack on Hill 396, held by the CCF. Simultaneously, the 53rd ROK Tank Company began shelling Hill 396. By 6 o'clock, Company B of the 73rd U.S. Tank Battalion arrived at Chunmasan, taking up firing positions alongside the 53rd ROK Tank Company. Throughout the day's fighting, Company B fired a total of 1,108 shells. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment launched a direct assault on the summit positions. U.S. and Korean artillery relentlessly bombarded the top of Hill 395, cutting off the northern ridgeline to prevent CCF reinforcements from reaching the summit. At the same time, all 3 battalions of the 30th ROK Regiment assembled at Sahudong, ready for further action. At 8:30, under the cover of heavy artillery fire, the 2nd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment launched an attack on the CCF positions at Hill 300, located on the western side of White Horse Mountain's main peak. By 10:20, the 3rd Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment joined the counterattack from the eastern side of the summit. The artillery support was exceptionally intense, with U.S. aircraft carrying out frequent sorties in support of the Korean counteroffensive. At 10:35, the 2nd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment successfully captured Hill 300 on the western flank. By noon, in the fierce battle for the summit, the 6th Company of the 2nd Battalion, 29th ROK Regiment, was the first to reach the top, retaking Hill 395. After 1330, the 1st Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment reached the left flank of the summit, securing their positions. Simultaneously, the 3rd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment advanced on the left to support the 2nd Battalion, with both battalions launching an attack on the CCF positions west of the summit. The CCF suffered heavy losses and struggled to maintain their defenses. For example, in the 6th Squad of the 2nd Platoon, Weapon Company, 3rd Battalion of the 334th CCF Regiment, 9 out of 13 were either killed or wounded. In response to the mounting casualties, General Jian Yonghui, commanding officer of the 38th CCF Army, ordered reinforcements from the 335th and 336th Regiments to be sent into battle. Major General Jenkins, commanding officer of the U.S. 9th Corps, made 2 helicopter flyovers of Hill 395 to observe the real-time situation on the battlefield while traveling between the French battalion's command post and the 9th ROK Division's headquarters. After assessing the situation, he arrived at the 9th ROK Division headquarters to discuss operational plans with the Korean commanders. At 1530, the CCF intensified their artillery barrage, and by 1545, the Korean forces briefly recaptured Hill 300 on the western flank. However, at 1620, with the arrival of CCF reinforcements, troops from the 335th Regiment and the 9th Company, 3rd Battalion of the 336th Regiment launched a series of wave attacks on the Korean positions at the summit. By around 1800 hours, the CCF forces broke through the defenses of the 2nd Company, 1st Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment, capturing the summit. The fighting continued for several more hours, and the 1st Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment began to fall back. The retreat of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions soon followed, and by 2000 hours, both units had pulled back from their positions. On the western flank, Korean forces also began retreating at 1820. Colonel Kim Bong-cheol, commanding officer of the 29th ROK Regiment, ordered his troops to establish defensive positions halfway down the mountain. These positions would be coordinated with the 2nd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment on the eastern side and the Reconnaissance Company of the 9th ROK Division on the western flank. In response to the changing battlefield, the 9th ROK Division adjusted its front lines, with the 51st Regiment taking responsibility for all defensive positions except for those on White Horse Mountain itself. At 1700 hours that afternoon, Company A of the 73rd U.S. Tank Battalion arrived in the area north of Chorwan to join the action. The tanks immediately engaged in bombardment, targeting CCF positions. The 1st Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment regrouped their forces south of the high ground after being pushed back during the intense fighting. At 1:20, the 1st Battalion launched several assaults on the summit, but each attack was repelled. Later, at 6 o'clock, CCF forces launched an attack on the southern part of the summit, but were driven back by the combined efforts of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 29th ROK Regiment. In the morning, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 28th ROK Regiment were moved to Hill 255 to regroup as a reserve force, with their positions taken over by the 2nd Battalion. Meanwhile, the 30th ROK Regiment, supported by artillery fire, launched an attack. At 8 o'clock, the 1st Battalion assaulted the summit from the south, while at 10 o'clock, the 2nd Battalion launched a pincer movement from the east, engaging the CCF forces from the 336th CCF Regiment who had reinforced the defenders. Amid the relentless artillery barrage, both sides engaged in intense close-quarters fighting, hurling grenades at one another. During Korean assaults, firepower was often well positioned, allowing small units to approach the CCF defenses. As the CCF soldiers stood up to throw grenades, the Koreans unleashed concentrated fire. At the same time, the 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion utilized mortars and recoilless rifles to neutralize CCF strongpoints. The 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion of the CCF 335th Regiment, which had just arrived at the front line to launch an attack, was met with heavy shelling. The unit suffered such heavy losses that it was reduced to the size of a single platoon. The platoon leader of the 1st platoon led the 1st squad into the trenches, where only one soldier survived. Meanwhile, Zhao Fangyu, the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, displayed a lack of initiative and ineffective leadership, resulting in the loss of the 3rd Company's positions. In the critical moments of battle, he abandoned his post and fled. The Korean 1st Company assault force launched repeated attacks. During the initial assault, the platoon leader of the 2nd platoon was killed, and in the following attack, the platoon leader of the 3rd platoon was wounded. By 10:50, the 1st Company's offensive had been repelled once again, leaving only 30 men in the unit. Captain Ku Banwon, the commanding officer of the 1st Company, requested that the reserve 2nd Company take over the assault, but Battalion Commanding Officer Major Kim Young-seon urged them to press on. At 1300 hours, the 1st Company launched one final charge. Leading the assault were platoon leader Kang Sung-woo and soldiers Oh Kyu-bang and An Young-kwan, who heroically stormed the CCF machine gun positions. After destroying the enemy position, all 3 were killed in action. They would later be honored as the 3 heroes of White Horse Mountain and posthumously awarded the Yulji Order of Military Merit. By 1320, the 1st Battalion finally captured the summit of White Horse Mountain. The personnel officer reported that only about 10 soldiers remained in the 1st Company. The company commander was critically wounded, with 2 platoon leaders killed and another wounded. After the forces of the 30th ROK Regiment captured the summit of White Horse Mountain, they engaged in fierce combat with CCF units on Camel Ridge to the north. The intense fighting continued throughout the day. Simultaneously, the Korean front line was once again adjusted. The 30th ROK Regiment was tasked with defending the entire White Horse Mountain area. The 1st Battalion held the summit, the 2nd Battalion covered the left flank, and the 3rd Battalion guarded the right flank. The 29th ROK Regiment assembled at Hill 255 by 1750, designated as the reserve force. Between 1800 hours and 1830, Companies C and A of the 73rd U.S. Tank Battalion withdrew from the battlefield, returning to the 7th U.S. Division staging area to prepare for the upcoming Operation Showdown, known as the Battle of Triangle Hill. Company B remained behind to support the 9th ROK Division until the afternoon of the 15th, after which it, too, would be deployed to Triangle Hill. At 1930, General Jiang Yonghui, commanding officer of the 38th CCF Army, ordered the 2nd Battalion of the 335th Regiment and the 8th Company of the 3rd Battalion, 336th Regiment, to launch an attack on White Horse Mountain from multiple directions. By 2300 hours, the situation reached a stalemate as both sides fiercely battled near the summit, hurling grenades at each other. On the eastern side, the 3rd Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment engaged the CCF in brutal hand-to-hand combat, while the 1st Battalion seized the opportunity to strike and repel the CCF forces. That same night, in an effort to disrupt UN operations on White Horse Mountain, 3rd Battalion of the 87th Regiment, 29th CCF Division, launched a surprise attack on Hill 391 at 1825. 8th Company of the 2nd Battalion, 51st ROK Regiment, some accounts suggest it was the 3rd Company, defending the hill, was overwhelmed. The surviving personnel were regrouped into a single platoon, joined by a platoon from the Regimental Reconnaissance Company. The next day, these forces, along with Company G of the 2nd Battalion, 17th Regiment of the 7th U.S. Division, launched a counterattack. The two sides faced off in a standoff near Hill 391, and Major General Kim Jong-ho, commanding officer of the 9th ROK Division, dispatched the 2nd Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment from Hill 255 to Isanani to support the ongoing battle at Hill 391. At 3 o'clock on October 13th, the CCF began to scale back their offensive, pulling their forces back to defensive positions. During this process, the 3rd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment launched a counterattack from the northern side of the summit. The 9th Company advanced on the western Hill 300 as the left flank, while the 11th Company targeted Camel Ridge on the right flank. On the western side of Hill 300, both sides fiercely clashed, neither willing to yield ground. At 5:10, the Korean 9th Company captured the western Hill 300, while the 11th Company secured one of the peaks on Camel Ridge to the east by 8 o'clock. The Korean forces used echelon formations to sustain continuous, wave-like assaults, aiming to exhaust the CCF and prevent them from regrouping. However, by 8:30, the CCF recaptured Hill 300, forcing the Korean troops to retreat and regroup. Shortly thereafter, Company B of the 140th U.S. Tank Battalion arrived on the battlefield, taking up firing positions between Sangmasan and Chungmasan to join the fight. At 12:15, Company B commanding officer Lieutenant Warren Cressy, a decorated World War II hero who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, was seriously wounded by CCF mortar fire while standing outside his tank. Despite being an African American, Cressy commanded a white tank company, a rare distinction at the time. After returning to the U.S., he spent years recovering from his injuries. At 13:45, the Korean 9th Company, reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment, successfully recaptured Hill 300. The 2nd, 3rd, and 9th Companies of the 28th ROK Regiment quickly fortified their positions, preparing for the next round of defense. The CCF responded by deploying the 3rd Battalions of the 335th and 336th CCF regiments, which had been rested and reorganized, back into the battle. At 17:20, CCF forces launched an assault on the Korean 1st Battalion's positions on Hill 300, but the attack was repelled. During a subsequent counterattack, the 2nd Platoon of the 9th Company, 3rd Battalion, 336th CCF Regiment, approached within 30 meters of the Korean positions, preparing for a final charge. Suddenly, a Chinese-speaking individual appeared from the Korean lines, shouting, "We're all on the same side. Why are we fighting?" Believing it to be true, the CCF soldiers paused and looked around. At that moment, prepositioned Korean machine guns opened fire, causing casualties among the CCF, including both the platoon leader and deputy, along with 4 other soldiers. At 18:30, the 7th and 8th Companies of the 2nd Battalion, 334th CCF Regiment, launched a fierce assault on the positions held by the Korean 11th Company, 3rd Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment, on Camel Ridge. By 2200 hours, the 11th Company was forced to retreat to the main peak. With support from the 1st Battalion of the 30th ROK Regiment, the Korean forces mounted a counterattack, eventually repelling the CCF assault on the summit. From this point on, the CCF shifted into a defensive posture. Major General Kim Jong-ho ordered the 28th ROK Regiment to maintain the defense, while the 29th ROK Regiment was tasked with launching an assault to recapture Camel Ridge from the CCF. Following an intense artillery barrage, the 1st Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment crossed the defensive line at 6 o'clock and advanced toward Camel Ridge, reaching the area by 8 o'clock. U.S. and Korean artillery units concentrated their fire on the CCF defensive positions. Beginning at 9:15, both sides engaged in brutal combat near the first peak of Camel Ridge. The fierce fighting lasted for several hours. The recently deployed 2nd Battalion of the 336th CCF Regiment put up a determined defense. The 5th Company alone suffered around 100 casualties before withdrawing from the battle, while the 8th Company of the 3rd Battalion incurred approximately 150 casualties. At 15:30, Lieutenant Vincent Degon, commanding officer of Company B, 73rd U.S. Tank Battalion, was scouting a route in his tank when the left track triggered a landmine. The force of the explosion, due to the open hatch, threw Lieutenant Degon from the tank. He sustained serious injuries and was urgently evacuated from the battlefield. At 16:30, the 3rd Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment received orders from the regimental commander to relieve the 1st Battalion, taking up positions to face the reinforced CCF forces on the northern slopes of White Horse Mountain. By the afternoon, the intensity of the fighting began to decrease. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion of the 28th ROK Regiment was tasked with holding Hill 300. On the night of October 14th, the 30th ROK Regiment assumed responsibility for defending the front lines, while the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 28th ROK Regiment regrouped at Hill 255. In the early hours of October 15th, the 3rd Battalion of the 29th ROK Regiment withdrew to the southern end of White Horse Mountain to regroup. General Jiang Yonghui, commanding officer of the 38th CCF Army, concluded that the ongoing battle was too costly and decided to withdraw his forces. By 3 o'clock, units of the 38th Army began retreating from White Horse Mountain. At dawn, the 29th ROK Regiment's 3rd Battalion led the first wave of the attack northward, followed by the 2nd Battalion at 9 o'clock, with artillery providing concentrated fire support. The remaining CCF troops steadily withdrew from the mountain. By 11 o'clock, the 9th ROK Division had successfully reclaimed all the positions on White Horse Mountain that had been fiercely contested over the previous days. After 10 days of intense close-quarters combat, by midday on October 15th, the entire White Horse Mountain began to fall silent. On that same day, Brigadier General Kim Jiangan, the newly appointed commanding officer of the 9th ROK Division, arrived at the division headquarters. Major General Kim Jong-ho completed the handover of command and departed 5 days later. For his exceptional leadership during the Battle of White Horse Mountain, Major General Kim Jong-ho was awarded the Taeguk Order of Military Merit and the Distinguished Service Cross. In the Battle of White Horse Mountain, the 9th ROK Division reported a total of 3,511 casualties. The United Nations forces, including artillery and tank units, also experienced minor combat losses. On the other side, the CCF reported 5,901 casualties. The United Nations Command reported capturing a total of 51 Chinese soldiers during the battle. In the fighting at Arrowhead Ridge, the French Battalion, along with its attached Korean units, reported 196 casualties. The CCF reported 971 casualties, and the United Nations Command captured 11 Chinese soldiers in the course of the battle. That concludes the full account of the Battle of White Horse Mountain during the Korean War. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment to support us in creating more high-quality videos. Thank you.